I have a question for you. Would you move across the country if you knew that it would allow you to retire 2 years earlier than you're planning, or would allow you to spend more money in retirement? Would you do that? Would you move across the country? It's an interesting question. Welcome to the Retirement Answer Man Show. My name is Roger Whitney, and this is the show dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement. We want you to rock retirement. And this month, we're talking about where to live in retirement. And last, we talked about the status quo bias. Now we want to talk about how do you build a vision of what you would like your environment to look like so you can be intentional about making these decisions. So we're going to do that right after a word from our sponsor. One way to get yourself out of status quo thinking is to surround yourself with people that are very much like you on the same journey that are doing things differently. You have a collective wisdom that comes from that to challenge your assumptions. And if you can do that in a safe place where there's respectful conversation led by a great team, all the better. Well, we have that with the Rock Retirement Club. And if you're looking to have a fresh look on things and see how other people like you are actually doing retirement, I invite you to go check it out at rockretirementclub.com.
Huh? What does that mean?
So in the What's That Mean segment today, I thought we would define what a bond ladder is. We talk about these things sometimes, and maybe you've never done one before and you may understand it conceptually. So a bond ladder is nothing more than buying a bond, or it could be a CD, that matures at a certain date, and then buying them in sequence. So as an example, if you were to do a 5-year bond ladder, you would buy a bond that matures in a year, then you would buy a bond that matures in 2 years, and then in 3 years, in 4 years, and 5 years. And so every year you would be having generally an equal amount come due. And then at the end of the first year, when that bond comes due, traditionally what would happen is you would go out and buy the next bond at the top of the ladder. And that's why they call it a ladder, because it's all like rungs of a ladder. We use that kind of technique when we're building the pie cake in funding consumption, right? So if you know you're going to need $200,000 a year, you can build, say, a 5-year bond ladder or CDs, and you have $200,000 coming due right before you know you're going to need it for the next year. And that way you're pre-funding your consumption. So that's essentially what a bond ladder is. And the value to it in the retirement context with the pie cake is the fact that you're pre-funding your near-term spending, so you don't have to wonder about it. So when a virus hits or a market correction hits, it's not going to be impacted by the markets. You've already pre-funded the spending or the consumption that you're going to be doing for 5 years. And then you can start to ladder out the portfolio longer term. So when life happens in markets like they do right now, you can statistically set yourself up for better investing experience. So that's how you might use it there. With that, let's go into how do you build your retirement profile to get out of the status quo, or at least challenge it. So the question before the house is, would you move across the country if you could retire 2 years earlier? 2 years. Think about the kind of work you're doing. Maybe you're really stressed out. Could you get out of it 2 years earlier? Would you move across the country? In some situations, that is the question before the house. I've dealt with situations like that where a client was imagining, okay, I live in, we'll just say California, and I've lived here all my life, but I was thinking of moving to Texas or Florida. It doesn't really matter where. And by doing the planning, it was clear that, wow, if I moved, say, to Florida from California because of a variety of factors, I could probably afford to retire 2 years earlier or have more go-go in my early years because of various things, which we'll get into. That puts a little bit of a fine point on it when you can define that, doesn't it? I can stay the current course and work 2 more years, or I could retire tomorrow if I was willing to do this other thing. You could take that to an extreme, and some people do. I say it's an extreme, it's not for them, of moving to Mexico or South America. That could maybe buy you 10, 20 years of not working. That's maybe a little bit more disruptive than most of us want, but it's possible. And it could work the opposite way. I had a client once where they were looking at actually moving from Dallas to Fort Worth. They had young children. They were in the Highland Park area of Dallas, which is a very affluent area. And they were looking to move back to Fort Worth because that's where a lot of their family was, maybe 30 miles away. And in doing the analysis, it ended up from a financial perspective, not making any sense at all. When you looked at real estate taxes, you looked at schools because they had young kids and everything else, it made sense to be in Highland Park. Whereas your first initial reaction was, no, it's a slam dunk, go to Fort Worth. That's much more chill, but it really didn't make sense. And they made a decision balancing what they wanted for their family with the economics of it. Because that's what it's going to come down to, right? One person may say, no, I can't leave California. I am a California lifestyle kind of person. And that's okay. The other person might say, oh yeah, I'd totally move to Florida if I could get out of work 2 years earlier. Both of those are correct answers. And I think the key is in going through this process of intentionality in terms of where you live, but also lots of other things, is making the decision intentionally. So we're not doing it based off of status quo. We think of the top 5 regrets of people at the end of life. 2 of them are, one, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself. Another is, I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. And these 2 come into play when we're dealing with creating this profile. If true to yourself is living by the ocean in California, and you're not going to be happy in the middle of the country in Texas or Oklahoma, you got to be true to that. Secondly, if you're married, especially during this retirement transition, we have to make sure that people have the courage to, in a safe environment, to express their feelings, because spouses may have different views of where they want to live. And we're going to have to incorporate that into this, and we'll do our best to do that. So what we're trying to do here today is talk about how do you create that living profile? What are some of the things that you need to think about? And I would do this through the lens of, as much as you can get in touch with it, how do you feel about your environment? Because our environment really is the foundation for setting ourselves up for success and happiness. So as much as you can turn on the EQ as much as the IQ, we want to make sure we understand that. So the first area that we want to consider is climate. Do you enjoy the warm? Do you enjoy the cold? Do you enjoy seasons? If you live in San Diego, as an example, that's a very consistent climate. There's not a lot of variation. Some people need that. Other people, it would drive them nuts. So I think of Shauna and I, because I was sort of going through this as I was doing the outline for this show. And okay, well, how do we answer that? Because we're evaluating this stuff. I enjoy seasons. I don't think I could live in Seattle. I don't think I could handle the clouds. I need sun, but I like seasons. Shauna, she's not moving up north. She's not going to go back to Michigan. She's not going to go where it's cloudy. She likes warm. She likes sun, but she doesn't like humid. She wouldn't like Florida or areas that are going to have a lot of humidity, especially with her arthritis. So that starts to frame in. So each of us needs to decide, what kind of climate do we thrive in? There are people that are extremely happy and love the climate of Seattle or South Florida, like my sister. I couldn't do either. So start to frame in, what kind of climate do you enjoy that will facilitate you doing things or doing the kind of things that you want? So that's climate. So if we have climate, then we have, do we want country? Do we want a rural, suburban, urban? I have a buddy here locally that's from Mississippi, and he and his wife, they can't wait at some point in their life to go back to Mississippi and have country, tons of land. They're outdoor kind of people. They grew up hunting and fishing and just having lots of land and no HOAs and all that other stuff. So they want to be in the country. When I think of Shauna and I'm more of a suburban to urban, small urban. I've never lived in an urban downtown area, but I see the attraction of it. Though I think I would want a small urban area like a Fort Worth more than I would want, say, a New York City. Shauna, I'm going to have to make a disclaimer here. I'm imputing her answers to these because I didn't have the chance to actually have this conversation, but we've had a lot of conversations in general about this. She likes suburban, but likes to be near urban areas. I think she likes the tween. She likes to be near urban, but also be able to get to the country pretty quickly. There are some people that grew up in New York City and haven't had a car in forever, or Boston, and they could not imagine living in Mississippi, say. So it's important that we understand that. Now, what about housing? So you have the single family home, the quote unquote American dream. That's where a lot of us may live now because that was very conducive to growing families. You have the lot size of your house. I've lived on 5 acres. I've lived on postage stamps. I think right now, what do we have? 1/3 to 1/2 of an acre, not quite a half. It seems to be a good manageable. You have a little bit of breathing room, but what lot size would you want on your single family home? Townhome. So we think of townhome. I think of the townhomes that we lived in when I was really, really young, and they weren't that great. I mean, it was a very inexpensive way to live because that's the stage we were at family-wise. But I've visited people that live in really nice townhomes in the uptown area of Dallas or in other parts of the country where this is like 3 floors, just decked out, beautiful, with some shared green spaces. So a townhome, we have to revisit things because we can have a lot of preconceptions on things, right? My preconception of a townhome is like, but there are some pretty fancy, nice ones. Condo. Some people love condo living. I've talked with my wife. I've teased out, hey, we could move to downtown Austin, live in a high rise. I have a good friend that lives in a high rise in downtown Austin. You can walk to everything. To her, and then you have a beautiful view because you're 40, 50 stories up. She has no interest in that at all. She thinks of that as it feels like an apartment. You're walking down these big halls. But my friend that lives there and his wife, and they love it. Do you want an HOA? We have an HOA here, and some can be very militant. Some, there are no HOAs, and you can do whatever you want. There's advantages and disadvantages to each. My friend that wants to go back to Mississippi, he hates that he lives in a neighborhood with an HOA. It just drives him nuts because he's used to living in the country and doing what you want. Would you be open to a planned community? Think of the Villages in Florida. I need to go down there. My aunt just moved to the Villages, which is this, if you're not familiar with it, this huge planned community. I mean, when I say huge, it's a big, decent sized city, planned community of housing from medium to high end with lots of organizations and facilities. You literally don't have to go out of the complex. I think there's over 500,000 homes there or something. And I plan on going to visit her and doing a tour of it and sharing that with you. I just haven't had a chance to get there. But do you want something like that? There are more and more facilities catering to seniors. I don't know if you consider yourself a senior, that have these independent, you're in the house, you have this built-in community. She is already teaching transcendental meditation and has clubs, and you have this built-in community of, it's like high-end summer camp for retirees, right? There's just always something going on, and you can find your people. That can be attractive to some. It can feel sterile to others. But these are the kind of things that we want to start thinking about in housing to explore with an open mind. And then you have infrastructure. Do you want to, I would love to be near bike trails and bike lanes and transportation options. I like being near a huge airport because we like to travel a lot. I like the highways. And then obviously the network, here in where we live now, we have family, my wife's family, which is a big tie. We like to golf. So golf courses would be important. Amenities. Some people want water, be near water, and that can be different things, right? That can be a river. That can be a lake. That can be an ocean. I want to be near mountain bike trails. Now I live in North Texas. They're not mountains, but they're trails I can ride on and hopefully not kill myself. Safe cycling roads, cool restaurants, near a major airport. For me, I want to be near a university town. Not necessarily live in it, but I like having universities around because there's a different vibe to them. There's an energy to them. Some people don't want that. And I'm just going through these to help prompt your thinking. And then obviously healthcare. You want to make sure you're near healthcare. If you're in the country or rural, there's a big issue with access to healthcare or quality healthcare. And as we get older, that's going to be a consideration. One thing I've done is I have a lot of clients that are ranchers or that live out in the country, and they recognize that not just because of the healthcare, but the remoteness, which creates isolation, and then the upkeep. And so a lot of times what we'll do there is think through how to be there and then transition. And then what are you transitioning to slowly come in to have the resources around you? This is the kind of stuff you want to think about, right? And then lastly, what about the cost of living, which is a big driver in a lot of ways. And this is where we get to understanding the trade-offs from a state, right? Because we got taxes, income taxes, we have real estate taxes, we have sales taxes. Different states will tax distributions or pensions differently. We have housing cost. right? That can be prohibitive, say in California or in Boston, whereas in Texas, it can be a big advantage. And that's some of the trade-offs that we have to factor in this. If you come from California, you're coming to, say, Texas or Florida, where the home prices are a lot more reasonable. We don't have state tax, etc., but you're giving up some of the environmental things, maybe. You have groceries, gasoline, all the tax, the cost of living, every area. You go into the flyover country, a lot of these things could be a lot less expensive, but there's a trade-off to those. You have the cost of living in terms of crime and grime, I call it, right? Some places are safer than others. And that, I think of that as a cost of living or a tax of some sort. Some places are just hard from that perspective. I think of when I go to Santa Monica, which is a beautiful area. I go there about once a quarter. And when I walk the streets, I've never experienced crime, but I've experienced a lot of grime. And that can not be annoying at all, or it can be very unpleasant. But that's something to evaluate about a place. So we talked about a lot of things. We've talked about climate, country to urban, housing, cost of living, infrastructure, networks, amenities. How do you make your decision? How do you start to build this profile? So I have just a couple tips for you. Number one is you can build what's called a vision board, which you can categorize things. You can take a big board, usually it's a big cardboard thing that you put on the wall, and you can divide it into sections: housing, amenities, cost of living, infrastructure, the X factor. Pick your categories. And then usually what will happen is people will write words. They'll cut out pictures or print pictures and put them in the various areas of things that they're attracted to. Sometimes it's at an intellectual level. Sometimes it's just visceral. And then they'll start to fill in the sections, all the different sections, with pictures or ideas that they find attractive. And that will slowly build a vision of the environment that you are attracted to. Another thing you can do is do a mind map. I like mind maps, and you can do this on paper. There are software programs. I will share a mind map in 6-Shot Saturday. So if you're not part of 6-Shot Saturday, that is just our weekly email on Saturdays where we give 6 quick tips, usually a summary of the show and some things that we're reading or taking a look at. And it creates a lot of conversation and it allows us to share some resources. So I will share an example of a mind map that you can use. I'll tell you the software. I use MindNode, which is an Apple product, or not Apple product, but for Apple. But there are other software programs that do my mind maps. I like them a lot. You can actually just do it on paper. That's a great way to do it too. But I'll share an example of a mind map of a profile of where to live. And then one last tip, and I think this one's really important if you're married for sure, is do them separately. And do them separately without the other one seeing or having input on it. Do it for yourself and have your spouse do it for themselves without you commenting, or I think best just don't even see it, because each of you are going to have to define what's important to you individually. I've had couples that do vision boards together, which is awesome. So if you have that kind of relationship, it's awesome. But my point is, we want to make sure that both people have the space to share their vision without the other one influencing it. That's really important. Once that's done, then you can swap vision boards or mind maps or what have you, take them, digest them with an open mind, and then come together and have a discussion to reconcile the differences and find the things that are similar. Sean and I have had to do this in a lot of ways, right? Because I am okay with changing the status quo. She is not. And we have done it through a series of just little conversations that are fairly intentional, where we're just talking about it in open terms without the pressure of having to make a decision. And I guess that's the last tip, is creating this kind of vision is not a weekend getaway. I mean, some people may do it that way, but to me, it's an ongoing conversation where you address it a little bit and you talk about it in very light terms, and then you step away and then you come back. It's a journey. It's not a project with a hard deadline, but I think it will help you, if you're solo, or help you and your spouse start to think intentionally about it. Because ultimately, if you get to the decision, would I move across the country to retire 2 years earlier? You're going to be better equipped to make that negotiation to find a good solution for yourself. So next week on the show, what we're going to do is talk about how do you experiment and ultimately make a decision on this so you can make sure that you are set up to, well, rock retirement. And with that, let's get to our conversation with Q&A, your questions and answers with Nicole. Okay, let's bring on one of my favorite people in the world, Nicole Mills. Hey, Nicole, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I sound like a frog again. I am like the markets lately. I'm up and then I'm
You're
sick.
Up and down and oh no.
And then I'm sick. I joke a lot that I have the corona, and I don't think that's necessarily funny.
Probably not a good thing to joke about.
I blame my wife for giving me the corona because she drinks corona.
Are you practicing good hand washing? That's really the important thing.
Yes, I am. And it's not like I travel a lot lately anyway, so that's good. Although I'm supposed to go speak at a conference end of March in New Orleans. So we'll see if that happens.
It's interesting. So I'm in Austin now, right? And they've decided they're not going to cancel South by Southwest because they don't think it's going to make a difference. City Council doesn't on coronavirus infections and such. And I'm like, well, there's a lot of other big conferences and things that do think it's going to make a difference.
Now that's like the real...
We'll see.
That's the music festival, correct?
The music and technology, yeah. And it's a big thing. People come from all over.
Is it like the grungy kind of music and all that?
No.
No, okay. So then maybe they wash their hands. They definitely need to be washing their hands at a festival.
Hopefully they will be.
Yes, okay. But anyway, that's not why we're here. We are here to hopefully intelligently answer some listener questions. So do we have any questions?
We do. Our first question is from Frank, and he wants to know about Roth conversions. He says, in a recent podcast, you talked about Roth conversion and recommended that we do a conversion if our income is low enough to take full advantage of a 12% tax bracket. However, at that same income level, the capital gains tax is 0%. Why not sell appreciated assets in a taxable account and not pay any tax instead of doing a Roth conversion?
Well, that's a great point because 0% tax sounds much better than 12% tax. Wouldn't you say, Nicole?
I would say so.
So that's a really great point, and it's a viable option that I really haven't discussed before on the show. The bigger point is filling up the tax brackets or making use of the tax brackets as much as you can. And so basically what Frank is talking about is if you are, let's say, married and you have income less than $80,000 before deductions and all that, you can sell an appreciated asset and your capital gains tax would be 0%. And then if you make over 80,000, it would be 15%. And then it can go up to 20% if you make a ton of money. So his point is, why not just sell appreciated assets rather than do a Roth conversion? And I think that's definitely a viable option, Frank, to deal with these tax buckets. One thing that it does, though, is it presupposes that someone has significant unrealized gains, which is not usually the case because most people are saving in their 401ks and IRAs, et cetera. But it definitely needs to be part of the decision set. And it's not something I mentioned before. So I'm really glad that you drew that out. So let's talk about that for a second. Let's think through this. Why would you not sell appreciated assets? One could be is that after-tax assets get a stepped-up cost basis when someone dies. So if you're married and one spouse dies, a portion of those assets get stepped up in cost basis, meaning that the value gets pegged at the date of the death. So those, for most people, the unrealized capital gain goes away. And let's talk about some of the objectives of a Roth conversion. Well, one objective is we want to minimize a pending RMD. I was going to use the word avalanche. That might be too strong.
I've never heard it put that way before.
The RMD avalanche. Well, basically, if you have a significant amount of pre-tax assets and you don't draw money because you're selling, let's say, appreciated investments and paying 0% tax, well, that money will grow in those tax-deferred accounts. And then when you hit now age 72, you're going to have to take out a percentage of assets every single year, and that percentage will increase every year until you pass away. Starts out at about 3.6% or so. So the first thing I do, Frank, in thinking through this is estimate what will be the RMDs, the required minimum distributions, if I don't touch the pre-tax assets. We want to know because once those RMDs start, you can't stop them, right? So a good example is just recently I had a case where absent doing anything, once the RMDs started, they were going to be $90,000 a year and they were going to go up from there, assuming growth rates and everything else. So knowing that that's coming, because when that happens, well, you don't have any control over realizing that income. That has to be a factor in this. And then the second part of this is if you're married, we also have to think of, depending on the health of both spouses, that eventually we're going to be in the single tax brackets, not the joint tax brackets, which are tighter, as we know. What I mean by that is we'll use capital gains in the 12% bracket. For a married filing jointly, it's about $80,000 in income. For a single person, it's $40,000 in income at the top of those brackets. Those RMDs eventually will be hitting somebody's single bracket if one spouse predeceases the other. And other factors that lean towards a Roth conversion are you lock in the tax rate at 12%, because we know in 2025, absent legislative action, we're going to revert back to the old tax brackets, which have more tax brackets and the ranges of income are a lot tighter in terms of growing up. And you're going to lock in tax-free growth. So those are some of the things that lean towards doing Roth conversions to take advantage of that 12%, because that's a very low tax bracket to be able to realize income and convert it to tax-free forever. But you make a great point. I think you should consider potentially selling appreciated assets if you have those and getting 0%. And that might be the best answer depending on your situation. And a lot of this has to go with your view on tax rates, your view on taxes on capital gains and whether those will go up, and what your RMDs are going to look like. But great point, Frank, because I've never mentioned that before on the show, so I appreciate that.
Our next question is an audio question.
Oh, yeah. Let me get this running here.
Hi, Roger and Nicole. I've listened to every episode of your podcast and loved it from the beginning.
God bless you.
And since we all know you only give helpful hints and education online, I will try to frame my question as an academic situation. My question is, if one had already decided to use a bond ladder for necessary expenses in the 3 to 7 year time frame prior to and during retirement, what would the pros and cons of using a bond fund be versus specific bonds that mature each of the required years? Thanks in advance for your insights. I love the monthly deep dives. Keep up the good work.
Well, God bless you for listening to every episode. I appreciate that, Douglas. And I'm glad you enjoy it. So bond ladders versus bond funds for the income floor. So let's define our terms. The income floor is pre-funding your spending in retirement. So what you do is you buy a bond for the money you're going to spend in year 3, and then you buy another bond that will mature for the money you're going to spend in year 4. So you're pre-funding. So as they mature, the money comes into your account and you have money to spend. And a bond ladder is basically buying bonds at different maturities. So that's what he's talking about there. It sounds like you've already built a bond ladder and you're asking, why not just buy a bond fund? What are the pros and cons? So I don't like to use bond funds to fund the income floor. And the reason is bond funds go up and down in price and they never mature. So if you buy a bond fund and interest rates go up, the value of the bond fund will go down for a period of time, usually by the amount of its duration. That's the rule of thumb. So if a bond fund has a duration, which is basically the average maturity of the portfolio, say of 6, then interest rates go up by 1%. Theoretically, the bond fund would go down by 6%. We're near 0 on interest rates. I guess we could go negative, but down is probably not in the cards more than up as far as interest rates going up. And so bond funds can move up and down in value. And in year 3, if you used a bond fund, say for the whole thing, and then year 3, you need your money, your $100,000, you're going to have to sell enough shares to get you the $100,000 that you need, as an example. And we don't know what the value of that fund is going to be. It could be up. It could be down because we had a spike in interest rates. And so you're at the whim of the markets. So what I like about using bonds is this is money that you know you're going to spend. It's like a debt that's going to come due. And with buying an individual bond that matures on a specific date, as long as you don't sell it prior to maturity, it's going to pay back what it's promised to pay back on the maturity date, regardless of where interest rates are. And that's a sense of security that you don't have to worry about prices and everything else. And I think that's really important when you're in retirement and you don't have an income and you know you're going to need that money to live. Better to de-risk that as much as possible. Now, some of the cons of doing a bond ladder are that you have to actually go and find the bonds. And bonds are much more opaque than equities. They're harder to find, harder to source. They're a little bit confusing. And so doing that can be problematic for some people. There are things that have come out that are newer, like a bullet share, which is an ETF that owns a portfolio of bonds that mature on a specific date. And then the ETF basically pays out. But those are newer products, so they don't have a seasoned history. But for the bond ladder, to fund life, I prefer using cash, CDs, or bonds much more than using a bond fund because it's important that you have money to spend in retirement. I'm losing my voice, but what do we got next?
Our next question is from Charlie on target date funds. He writes, I just wanted to get your thoughts on robo-advisors and your thoughts on target date funds. You may have covered these in past podcasts, but with over 300 podcasts, that's a lot of searching. That's true.
Well, come on, Charlie. Douglas has listened to every one. He could probably tell you which number. Actually, I couldn't tell you. So I understand.
I was actually only able to find one where you had mentioned it, but I just did a quick search.
Did you really?
It was no means extensive.
Okay, so let's talk about target date funds, Charlie. So first, what is a target date fund? It is a fund that is designed to change its allocation based on a date. So a good example is, and I'm not recommending this one, but we'll just use it as an example. We'll use the Vanguard Target Date 2020 fund. And they have a 2025, a 2030. And the idea is that target date is the date of your maturity. So if you bought the Target Date 2020 fund back in 2010, it would have had, let's say, an allocation of 80% stocks, 20% bonds. I don't know that for a fact. I'm just making that up. 10 years ago. And then as you get closer to the target date, in this case, 2020, it slowly gets more conservative. Whereas if you looked at it today, it's 50% stocks and 50% bonds. So the idea is that as you get closer to retirement, it gets more conservative. I'm not a big fan of these. I think they're very generic and they're created to give an easy button for 401ks, because that's where they really started to be rolled out, to give a safe harbor for 401ks to, provide investment options that sort of protect their liability by using these. And their expenses can vary greatly. And ultimately, when you get towards retirement, you have to think totally differently about how you allocate your assets. Because up until in the accumulation stage, it's all about the asset side of the equation of growing assets and embracing risk. And then when you reach retirement, it becomes much more about the liability side of the ledger, which is the money that you're going to need to live, and matching your assets to fund the liabilities of retirement. And those liabilities represent the money that you're going to need to spend year in and year out. And I would go back and listen to the pie cake episode. I think it was the end of January, because a target date fund isn't going to think in those terms at all. It's just trying to give you a generic allocation that's going to move over time. If you were to use a fund of funds, I would prefer that you use a target fund, meaning it's targeting a specific allocation, let's say 60% stocks, 40% bonds, and it never deviates from that allocation. So I like those type of funds if you're trying to fill a spot in your portfolio in your pie cake and you want a simple answer to get the allocation for the specific layer of the cake that you're trying to fill. But so I'm not a huge fan of the target date funds. In terms of robo-advisors, To be honest with you, I haven't spent much time thinking about them. I basically think of them as a static allocation fund done in a more transparent way. So I don't really have much one view or the other about them, because basically they're targeting an allocation and they're going to have a rebalancing policy. So there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're comfortable with the allocation. So Nicole, before my voice goes out, why don't we go set a SMART Sprint?
Good idea.
On your marks, get set.
All right, it's time to set a little baby step for the next 7 days. So on this episode, Nicole, we're talking about creating your living profile. Intentionally thinking about the kind of environment you want to be surrounded by in retirement. That is the action for the next 7 days, is to start thinking about, how do you want to feel in your environment? What kind of climate do you want? What kind of amenities do you want? What is it you want to be surrounded by? And start, whether you're using a mind map or a vision board, to start to think about, if I could be in an environment that gave me a lot of things, what would that feel like? So a good example of that, Nicole, might be when I think of Colorado in the summer, right? I think of the place that we go to where the porch, I can see the mountains. There's a little pond with a trail around it that we can walk our dog to. There's 3 blocks to walk into town. I start to think of that and just think of how I feel in those environments. And that's a way of thinking up your ideal environment. But in this case, you want to do it in the environment that you're going to wake up every day in when you're in retirement. So why don't you start noodling on that over the next 7 days?
Would you still want to live in Colorado in like the winter?
Heck no.
I'm curious.
No, no.
Well, you grew up in snowy winters. I thought,
That's
there'd be
well,
a little nostalgia there, but evidently no.
well, I'm probably more open to it than my wife. If my wife came up here and you asked her that question, I'd have to bleep out her words.
Emphatic no.
Emphatic no before no. So Nicole, recently we started this feature of sharing some feedback from listeners.
How do you think that's going?
I think it's going awesome. Except I think we asked for feedback on correcting us, or me more than you, obviously. And evidently I say a lot of things incorrectly.
I don't think that you say a lot of things incorrectly. I think perhaps people don't realize that we are not scripted. So sometimes we misspeak, but it's recorded and it's out there forever.
That is very true. I remember when we wrote the book, having it on paper in black and white. And once it was to the publisher, you couldn't change it. It was more intimidating than doing this, because when we're on the show, you're right. I have a brief outline and we're just chatting with you, the listener, and with each other, Nicole and I. And it's all not off the cuff, because there's some prep, but there's no scripting at all. And life gets messy, and you hear it differently than we verbalize it. So, but we appreciate the feedback. I just got a long piece of feedback on the Rock Retirement Club, and it was wonderful. You love the stuff, and they're not renewing because they don't have the time for it. And there are a couple things that they're already a power user of that kind of information, but it was still very positive, and he took the time to share his thoughts because he cared. And that's the best part of it. I think people that give us the grammatical corrections, they do it because they care.
Oh, I think so too.
Yeah, so we appreciate that. Appreciate any feedback we get. All right, Nicole, I am off to the doctor.
Please go rest.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.